Welcome to Whisper of the Oracle. I'm your host, Juha Saarnilampi. Do you hate losing to fatigue? Because I do. It's super frustrating when you feel really stupid at the end of the game. You weren't coming in prepared, didn't build your deck right, or you didn't have the game plan correct. And it is simply a fact that the way the game mechanics work, fatigue will always be a part of it. So what is fatigue? Fatigue in general consists of two parts. There's fatigue by defense, which is maybe what most people associate fatigue with, and then there's fatigue by damage. And usually what happens nowadays is a combination of both. It's a mix of defense and offense, where either the offense is eventually threatening lethal, and that's why you have to start blocking it, or it has on-hit effects that forces you to block it, otherwise your own turns would be so completely inefficient. Speaking of fatigue by defense, it's usually done with very, very efficient defensive cards, such as Sink Below. It's probably still the best, most widely used card in the game. Evos are another good example. You give Teklovossen a bit of time, and they will play an Evo or two, and suddenly they have 3 or 6 more defense actually to deal with. Oasis Respite, especially combined with Tunic, super effective. Oldham's Hero ability, of course, is another great example of fatiguing by defense, where you can pitch cards into your deck and still prevent damage. Also, the ice side of it was very good at preventing big turns from happening, because you could, at will, get your opponent to put a card on top of their deck. Fatigue by damage side, as I said, it consists of threatening lethal, which forces your opponent to block, or threatening on hits. Good examples here are War Machine, destroying their arsenal, or Spinal Crush, preventing them from having go again, and thus basically completely neutering their turn. Then how does fatigue win? Fatigue basically runs you out of one or multiple of 3 things. The simplest one to understand maybe is damage in deck. So this is like the pure fatigue, where you actually run the opponent out of ways to deal damage. This can be done, for example, against Rangers, where they otherwise have a very red-heavy deck, and thus most of their cards deal a good amount of damage, but they don't have a weapon. So you can actually run a Ranger completely out of ways to deal damage. Secondly, you can run your opponent out of threats in deck. This means, for example, that against Levaya, you run them out of Bloodrush Bellows, you run them out of Art of Wars, Dominate effects, cards like that, which can deal more damage per turn than you can defend. And because over the course of the game, they will probably spend more cards than your fatigue deck does, then as long as you run them out of these threats, then you're in the clear. Thirdly, you can run the opponent out of threat density. Threat density is when you've maybe gone through first cycle, prevented or blocked most of their threats, and what they're left with is a huge amount of blues and some reds, some powerful damage cards in there, but they're probably not clumped enough for them to be threatened. So how do you beat fatigue? I will present 6 ways to do this. Number 1 is evasion. Think of dominate, think of intimidate, think of overpower. This was very, very powerful in Bright Lights Limited. Think of arcane damage. Enough arcane damage beyond their AB is always going to go through. Many ways like this can be utilized and have been utilized by aggro decks and mid-range decks in the past to make sure that they can close games and don't get stuck in that loop of trying to find the final bit of damage and then succumbing to fatigue at the end. Number 2 is big turns. Rather than trying to go for 13 or 14 damage every turn, you try to go for 6 damage one turn and then 21 damage the next turn. And you do that enough times, and your opponent is going to be in a bit of trouble, because even if they try to do the same, if they try to block with 3 cards one turn and then 5 cards the next turn, if they have a defense reaction, you're still going to be leaking damage, because offense is more efficient than defense, especially if you can build it up in bigger bursts. If your deck is such that it can, not exponentially necessary, but at least non-linearly scale its damage with the number of cards you're using. So let's say your 4-card hand can deal 13 damage, but a really good 5-card hand can deal 20 damage. Then you should make sure that you get those 5-card hands and not those 4-card hands, because the 4-card hands are not really doing much against the fatigue deck. Good examples are, of course, the Ether Wildfire combo, which can deal upwards of 500 damage if you pitch stack it. Max Velocity is a very good example, where you try to get a big turn, finish it off with a max velocity. Probably they've had to spend most, if not all, of their cards blocking everything before this, so you're coming in for 10 at the end, and they're out of cards already. Channel Mount Heroic was a very classic way, and is still a classic way in Blitz for Briar to deal a lot of damage on those critical channel turns. Art of War has been and will be a key tool in the arsenal of many aggro decks on trying to get these big turns. Number 3, Recursion. And this can happen in multiple ways. This can happen through your hero power, like in Fi's case. It's very, very difficult to fatigue Fi, simply for the reason that you're getting this Phoenix Flame loop at the end of the game, where if he still has Shuko up, he's coming in for 0, +3, +2, with just a couple blues. Remembrance and Quiver of Abyssal Depths, very similar effect, where you start shuffling the best anti-fatigue cards from your graveyard into your deck, or the most powerful cards, whether they are the ones that have evasion or they are the ones that enable you to have big turns. With sort of traditional value math, Remembrance is a horrible card. Levia has access to many anti-fatigue tools, one of them being the new demi-hero Plasmafet, where you can start playing back your Blood Debt cards from your Banish Zone. And then we have cards like Evergreen, which go to the bottom of your deck. There are many examples of this. Number 4 is weapon attacks. And this is, of course, the very, very classic way of battling fatigue. The Kodachi lock is real, so even though your ninja opponent only has blues in their deck, it's still going to be really tough defending them out because they come for 1/1 every turn. Teklo, Plasma Pistol, of course, combined with the items mentioned earlier, is very effective at this. So even though you've boosted most of your deck away, if you have Induction Chamber or 2 and a Plasma Purifier, it's very, very tough to fatigue you at that point if your opponent is at low life. Hot Streak, very good example of an anti-fatigue tool, where if your opponent's deck is full of attack actions, it's like a lose-lose situation for them. Either they're blocking this and you're attacking with a Centauri Saber, or they're not blocking it and taking 2. Number 5 is breakpoints. Breakpoints are super annoying to defend, and thus, if the dynamic of the game is such that either of you could fatigue, then if you're able to present your opponent with a lot of breakpoints, and they need to start defending them very inefficiently, so having to spend, for example, 3 blocks to block 1 damage or 3 blocks to block 2 damage, then you are winning in that race. If they spend 2 cards to block a Snatch, if they spend a full card to block a Phoenix Flame, if they spend any cards to block any part of Double Strike, basically, and if they spend cards to block something like a Rosetta Thorn, you are winning on fatigue math in those situations. And of course, the best breakpoints are not just vanilla damage, the best breakpoints have on hits attached to them. Number 6 is fat stacking. This by itself probably doesn't do the job. This combined with many of the strategies before can really help you. So if you're coming from a game like MTG, where it's basically always correct to play a flat 60, you are gonna laugh at this. And that's what I did when I started Fab. I was like, why would I ever play more than 60 cards? That's ridiculous. I am just diluting the power of my deck. But over time, you learn that in this game, it's actually a legitimate strategy to put 65 cards, 68 cards, maybe sometimes even something like 72 cards in your deck. In combination with other anti-fatigue tools, this is often the way to go. And Dash.io is a master of this. They probably play more than 60 cards into most matchups, as far as I know. And they combine it with Dominate. They combine it with really annoying breakpoints with the grenades. And they combine it with really big turns with max velocity and high octane and so on. So in summary, how to beat fatigue: you use a mix of these 6 strategies. You bring in evasion. You make sure that instead of attacking with 4 cards every turn for 13 or 14 damage or 12 damage or whatever, you try to vary your turns, attacking for 6 and 20, 6 and 20, something like that. Much better than 13 every turn. Bring in recursion if it fits your strategy. You pick decks that have weapons that don't spend cards from your deck, but that still provide that pressure to your opponent. You utilize breakpoints, try to come in for 4 or 7, or maybe what's the best breakpoint is 1. So if you come in for 100 times and your opponent has 63 blocks in their deck or 64 blocks in their deck and no equipment, they are still losing. And finally, when it's correct, it's not nearly always correct, but when it's correct, you combine some of these tools and some of these strategies with fat stacking. Thank you for watching. Here's another video for you to watch, and please do subscribe to the channel. It's always appreciated. Thank you so much.